guys, and welcome back. On this week's show, you know it, part 7 of our ukulele build. Well, as you know from last week's show, we ended up with some measurement discrepancies, and my own fault for not checking that before I started the project. I should know better, but everything happens for a reason, and in retrospect, we have one now that's too small and one that's the right size, but in retrospect, everything happens for a reason, and we ended up with a much higher quality instrument, and it's fantastic. It's everything seemed to come together better. This one held its shape much better. It fits in the forms better. Practice makes perfect. So I guess, like I said, everything happens for a reason, and the reason in this case is someone was saying, hey, you know what, you needed that one for practice, time to move on. So no harm, no foul. We got ourselves a new one, and a much better one at that. So now we're going to move along, and we're going to put the old one away, maybe use it for some practice cuts or whatever, I don't know. And see, I'm getting them confused now. This is the old one, this is the new one. Either way, it's time now to do the binding on the front face of the ukulele. And for that, we need to route a rabbit into this front profile. Well, like I said, we need to route a rabbit in the top of the ukulele for our binding. And the binding is a piece of wood, a small thin strip that goes all the way around the perimeter of the ukulele. And what it does is it serves a purpose to strengthen the joint that's there on the front between the soundboard and the sides and the back of the ukulele and the sides, but it also provides protection from dings and chips and breaks by adding that one little extra strip. Now, you can get commercially made bindings. They're available, plastic and wood. You can laminate your own. We're going to use a solid wood binding. I'm going to be making it out of maple, and it's going to be 1/16 of an inch thick by 3/16 wide. The length, of course, will be the complete perimeter measurement of your instrument. But what I've done now is I've taken a 1 1/4 inch diameter rabbit router bit, and I've installed a 1 1/8 inch bearing on it. And what that allows is a 1/16 inch cut on either side of the bearing. So by running the bearing along the instrument, our depth is already set. So all we need to do is set the height of it, and we should be good to go. The thing is that I'm going to run this a little shallow. I'm going to run this at 5/32 high so that I have some room to sand the binding once it gets glued in place. So I've gone ahead and I've taken a piece of our MDF form. This is from our old ukulele, so I thought I'd use it as a test cut. And I've run it through the router to get that rabbit. And so you can see here what it is that we're going to be looking for. And we need to route this exact rabbit in the top end of our ukulele, following, as I said, the exact same steps as what we did when we flush cut our top to our sides. But as well, we're going to coat the entire surface here with a layer of painter's tape to help prevent some tear out. that's a nerve-wracking experience if there ever was one. After all those hours of work and actually building it twice, it's a little scary to route out a rabbet like that all the way through the instrument. But it's done now, and let me just show you what it is that it should look like. And there we have it. It's a nice clean rabbet all the way around. There's no tear out. That painter's tape goes a long way to protecting the wood and helping with some tear out. So now that we have this rabbet cut in the body of the instrument, now we have to cut the binding. So for that, we're going to need some strips that are 1/16 of an inch thick by 3/32 wide, or sorry, 3/16 wide, and I think they're going to have to be at least 32 inches long. So we're going to head over to the table saw at this point and see what we can do. Well, we've got the table saw set up, and what we need to do at this point in time is to rip some strips from this scrap of maple 3/16 of an inch thick. And you just want to make sure that you've got a nice straight grain. I know that there's a couple little imperfections here, but I think those will be cut out when we actually rip our pieces for our binding. But for now, we're going to need a couple strips of this piece here. This is 32 inches long, and we're going to rip it at 3/16 of an inch. Well, we've changed up our blade, and although we're ripping, I've put in my fine cross-cut blade. I really don't want any tear out on these pieces of binding. So at this point in time now, you want to take your 3/16 inch pieces of maple or whatever wood you chose, and you want to rip them into 1/16 of an inch thick strips. So let's go ahead and do that. And if you remember, I had a show a while back that showed you how to use your adjustable square to consistently set your fence for that, so that your thin strips end up on the outside of the blade. So don't forget to use that little trick. Well, the strips are cut, and we've cut a few extra because, of course, I expect there to be some breakage. And although they're quite flexible, I really don't think that they're going to be able to be bent around the perimeter of the instrument. So, how much did you like bending the sides of the instrument? Because that's what we're going to have to do to bend these. The difference here is that we're going to put together two of the inside forms that we use to clamp everything together, and we're going to put two of those together so that we have the full profile of our ukulele body, and we're going to take these and bend them around that particular form. I don't think I'm going to have to soak these, although it would probably help. I'm going to try just to bend one just strictly using the steam from the rag and the bending pipe. I will point out, when you're cutting thin strips like this, especially with the ripping of the 3/16 inch thick stock earlier, you really want to make sure that that blade is square, so that as you're ripping it, you're getting consistent results top and bottom of your cut. So be sure to check your blade for square, guys. Well, we've got our forms, inner forms, screwed together. We screwed together both sides so that we would know that we're keeping this thing square. I noticed that when I only screwed one side down, what happened was the back end opened up, and that's going to give you some inconsistent results. So what we're going to do is we're going to heat up our pipe and bend our binding pieces the same way we bent our sides. We're going to be starting at the top end. And the reason we're going to start here is because any imperfections that we have, or any problems we have with the butt joint up here, is going to be hidden by the neck later on. So it becomes not so imperative to be perfect at that point. But we're going to start here and heat it up and start bending all the way around. And once we get it so that it's pliable enough and that we're happy with how it is situated onto this mold, then we're going to secure it there with whether it be clamps or surgical tubing. It's only 1/16 inch thick, so it shouldn't be hard to hold. And we're going to see how it goes. So let's get this pipe heated up to 375 degrees, and we're going to start bending this binding. So the pipe is up to temperature, and we're going to try to bend this without soaking the wood, just using the steam from this wet rag that I have draped over top of this hot pipe. And like I said, the temperature of this is going to be 375 degrees. So the goal here is to heat it up with the steam and bend it, and then get it onto our form so that we can set the shape. Just like that. I don't know if you can see that, but we're able to bend this quite easily. And all we're going to do is use our form and the steam from this rag to bend the binding to the shape of our instrument. So just like we bent the sides, we're going to go ahead and bend the binding, and when we're all said and done, I'll come back and show you what we've got here. For the record, it's bending just fine with just the steam. Well, that bent up really well. I'm actually surprised. I thought there might be issues with not soaking the maple, but truth be told, it actually bent up better than what the mahogany did. I was amazed at how fast it softened up with all the steam from that wet rag over the pipe. But either way, it's clamped up, and now we're just going to let this sit for a bit like this, and kind of let it cool down and dry out, make sure that, you know, it's going to keep that form. And while we're waiting for this particular piece to be to set up, what I'm going to do is we're going to cut and glue up the blank for the neck of the ukulele. Well, as I said, now we're waiting for that binding to set up, kind of thing. And while we're waiting, we're going to glue up the stock for the neck of the instrument. And for this particular neck, if I were to ballpark the figure that we need for our final stock, I would say it would be 12 inches long by 2.5 by 2.5. Now that's kind of overkill because a lot of that will be trimmed away with the bandsaw and the table saw to get the rough shape, but that's the measurement I'm going to go with. So 2.5 by 2.5 by 12. And I've got this piece of maple left over from the bench build, and I'm looking at it and I think it's going to be the perfect piece for what I need. So at this point in time, what I'm going to do with this is I'm going to trim this down to the length of 12 inches, but I'm going to joint it so that I get some good flat surfaces to work with right from the start. I don't want any gaps in this glue up. So I'm going to joint this piece, I'm going to cut them to their length of 12 inches, and then we're going to go ahead and glue them together. Well, we've checked both pieces with a straight edge, and I mean, it doesn't get any flatter than that. The straight edge is practically suction cupping itself right to the board. So we're going to go ahead and laminate these together, and again, we're going to clean up the joints afterwards on this. So if the edges aren't perfectly aligned, that's no big deal. We did leave extra to play with here. So we've got our swanky threaded rod spreader that we made there not too long ago. And it works just as good today as what it did back then when I first made it. As long as, of course, you put enough glue on it to get to the edges. But, there we go. Now that we have the glue all spread nicely onto there, we're going to go ahead and clamp these together. There's nothing that we can do for this today. So of course, we'll leave it overnight or possibly even till next week's show if we don't get it done in time. And who knows? For now, we're going to put these together, glue them up, clamp them, and let them completely 100% dry. And there we have our neck blank glued up. There is quite a bit of squeeze out, which makes it an ugly glue up, but I'm not too concerned. This has been cut oversized, and we're going to have plenty of material here, and we're going to trim it all down after with the table saw, clean everything up once it's dry. So for now, you know, don't worry too much about it. Don't go all crazy if you made it extra large like what I did. Just put it off to the side, and a chisel later will clean it up if the table saw doesn't, but I'm pretty sure the table saw will. Well, our next order of business is this, and this would be our binding. It's been in here for a few hours, so I'm going to unclamp it. I'm expecting quite a bit of spring back, but I'm okay with that because we're going to glue this into place on our body, and it will be clamped and held down into place. But I just wanted to get the initial shape bent so that we weren't getting any breakage while we're trying to bend it around the tight curves. So let's get this unclamped and see how well it fits on our body. So let's go ahead now and get our binding out of this form. Like I said, this is kind of just a rough bending of it. I don't expect it to keep the shape very well, as long as it's bent enough that it will fit on our instrument. And you can see there that it's had quite a bit of spring back, but yet it's still very pliable. So let's just see how well it's going to fit onto our instrument. The most important part here is in the waist, which is the area that I'm pushing in here in the middle right now. And you know what, those areas fit quite well. So I think I'm pleased with the way that this is going to be going in there and fitting. So I'm going to try to dry fit this a little better, and once I do, I'll come back and see you, and we'll start gluing this in place. Well, I've done a dry fit, and I'm fairly confident that things are going to go all right, but of course that could change. what we're going to do, you can see here I have a whole bunch of pieces of painter's tape here, and that is to assist me in holding down our binding. So what you want to do is get a little bit of glue into that rabbet that we cut earlier, and you want to make sure that you've got good adhesion here. So don't go crazy, just do little bits at a time. And what we're going to do is get it lined up in there, get it looking nice and pretty, pull the tape tight, and then lock it in place. And we're just going to carry on around the instrument. So get another little bit of glue in there, just like that, just along the rabbet here. You don't want to do too much at a time because it's tough enough to do as it is, especially if you're working alone. So hold it in place, get it nice and tight so that you're happy with the way it looks, and pull that tape tight and lock it down. Then you want to move around to the next section. And I know I'm probably getting my fingers right in your way, but I'm sorry, it's the only way that I can do this. So get your binding in place, a piece of painter's tape, push it in tight, pull it, just like that. All right, so just keep working your way around the ukulele and get that done. I'm going to see if I can reposition the camera and get you a better view of what it is that I'm doing. So hopefully you'll get a better view from this angle. Just going to add a little more glue in here. So we're just taking the binding, putting it tight into that rabbet joint, making sure that it's pushed in and down all the way, and then a piece of painter's tape securely to the side, pull it tight and across the body of the uke. Carry on as around the kerf of that rabbet, and we'll just push it in place. You could probably see here where having this this binding sort of pre-bent would go a long way to helping out here, and it does. I mean, I'd hate to be having to try to bend this while I'm going. That would just be a nightmare. So we'll just get some more glue into this rabbet, and we'll carry on around the rest of the instrument. And you can see we're still working our way slowly around the instrument, making sure that that tape is getting rubbed down onto the body here to hold that binding really secure. Just like that. And a couple more pieces of tape there will just finish that off. Just like that. Now, I can see right here, I have a gap in this binding, but I'm not too concerned about that. The reason I'm not too concerned is that there will be a mortise and tenon that gets cut into this end for the neck. So that little gap there, that's going to disappear once I cut it out for the mortise and tenon. So at this point I'm just going to go around and sort of peek in all these little cracks and crevices, seeing that the binding is is pushed in nice and firmly. I'm really hoping it is, and I may even squeeze this into the original form just to help get a little bit of extra pressure on there, especially in this waist area of the ukulele. And when I say waist, I don't mean waist like garbage. I mean waist like where you put your belt of your pants. Well, of course, now comes the waiting game. There's nothing we can do with that binding right now, of course, until it's completely dry. And bare minimum, that should be overnight. So don't even mess with it. Just leave it alone for at least overnight. The glue up for the neck, again, nothing I can do with it until the following day. Hindsight's 2020. If I would have thought about it, I probably would have laminated that throughout the week, filmed a little segment, and it would have been ready now to work on. But there is one thing that we can do at this point. The front and the back of the instrument are identical. So what we can do is go ahead, fire up that steam pipe again, or the bending pipe, and bend and form the binding for the back side of the ukulele, which we will need later on in the build. Don't need it right now, but might as well bend it up while we're waiting. And now with that, we've got our second piece of binding for the back of the instrument clamped up. Let me just show it to you here. I know you can't really see much, but here it is in our original form. And I'm just going to put this aside on a shelf here in the shop until such time as we need it. So I'm not going to mess with it. It's going to be clamped up for, oh gosh knows how long. We've got a lot more work to do on this before I get to the point where I'm going to be putting this backside binding on the instrument. And with that, I think we're going to have to call her quits on this week's show. I try to keep them at about a half an hour, but there's so much information here. There was a lot of progress made today with the rabbet being cut in the instrument, the bindings being cut, the bindings being formed and steam bent for both the front and the back, as well as the glue up for the neck, which we're going to get into next week. A lot of stuff. Guys, each half-hour show that I present to you represents hours upon hours of work with measuring, checking, double-checking. Like what you see here on the show is just a small fraction of what really happens, and I hope that I'm providing you enough that you'd be able to make your own instrument without any problems. But big week next week with getting the binding trimmed down to the instrument, getting it flush, getting it all pulling together there, and as well that neck. We're going to start on that. That's a big week next week. It's going to be a lot of fun. Guys, I really hope you're enjoying this, and take care of yourselves until next week's show when I'm going to be back again with yet another woodworking video. See you then.